Now that we understand how exposure works for shooting a single image at a time, let's apply this to live video production where we're shooting a constant stream of images. Here's what we need to know. Changing iris impacts depth of field. Changing shutter impacts motion blur, and changing ISO impacts noise and dynamic range. In live productions, we traditionally modify iris and sensitivity, but try to leave shutter alone. That's why the iris stick, or knob, is the most prominent feature of a traditional broadcast remote control panel, or shading panel. Like the iris of your eye, opening or closing the iris on the lens offers a really broad range of exposure adjustment through a single physical mechanism. Open it wide if it's dark, or close it down if it's bright. So first, let's talk about why we don't change shutter. If we use the shutter to modify exposure, it impacts the motion blur of the captured images. Shorten the shutter time and the exposure decreases, but motion can become very staccato, like in Saving Private Ryan. If we lengthen the exposure time, the exposure increases, but things can start getting smeary and feel like a dream sequence. Traditionally, broadcast video is shot with a 360-degree shutter, which means that the exposure time is equal to the frame rate. Each frame gets exposed for 1/60th of a second as the camera outputs 60 frames per second. This produces smooth, realistic feeling imagery. On many broadcast cameras, when the exposure time equals the frame rate, this is referred to as no shutter or shutter off. Even though there's still a shutter time contributing to the exposure equation, it's understood that the shutter is not being used as a tool to reduce the light gathering ability of the camera unless the function is actually turned on. Therefore, no shutter or shutter off is actually equal to 360-degree shutter by default in most broadcast cameras. If you're using a cinema camera or DSLR, you'll have to set the shutter value manually. Films or cinematic content, on the other hand, are usually shot with a 180-degree shutter at 24 frames per second. So each frame gets exposed for only 1/48th of a second, while the camera records at 24 frames per second. The exposure time equals only half of the frame rate, which is how we get the value of 180. The combination of the shorter exposure time and slower overall frame rate makes for a more surreal, juddery, filmic recording, which we've all come to expect when watching a movie. This frame rate and shutter rate combination can look great for music production, but can sometimes be a little much for speakers and preaching. In either case, these choices are generally fixed, and we don't want to mess with shutter speed during a live production unless there's good technical or creative reasons behind it. So, if iris is our main exposure tool and shutter is generally fixed, let's go back to the exposure equation and discuss how sensitivity plays into exposure. Exposure equals iris plus shutter plus sensitivity. Sensitivity, measured in gain or ISO, is the biggest contributor to noise in your image. As a general rule, lower gain or ISO means less noise, particularly in the shadows, and higher gain or ISO equals more noise, especially in the shadows. ISO settings can also impact dynamic range of an image. Extremely high or low values can reduce the camera's ability to render details in the shadows or highlights of the image. Every camera has a native sensitivity, a point at which the incoming light is not electronically adjusted up or down after the analog to digital converter on the sensor. Newer cameras are generally more sensitive to light, which means that zero gain on one camera might not equal zero gain on another camera, even though they might be using the same lens and shutter settings. Zero is simply whatever setting the internal circuitry runs at, and this varies from camera to camera. ISO, on the other hand, is a constant measurable value based on light receptivity. Think of this as a film stock setting, or a measurement of how the sensor will respond given a known amount of light. A roll of film shot in one camera should respond the exact same way to light in another camera, as long as the lens and shutter settings are the same, because it's the same physical material, or sensor, being exposed in both situations. With many newer cameras featuring dual native ISOs, which means there's not one but 2 points on the sensor where zero digital gain is applied, it gets a little more complicated. Ideally, stick at or near either native point on the sensor for the cleanest images, and try not to jump between the native ISOs. For example, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K has a dual native ISO of 400 and 3200. So from 100 to 1000, the camera acts like its base ISO is 400. And from ISO 1250 to 25,000, the camera acts as if its native sensitivity is 3200. If you find yourself at or near the cutoff between these two ranges, beware the jump of noise that will happen. Setting the ISO at 1000, for example, will look noisier in the shadows than 1250 will, even though 1250 is a higher value. because 1000 is derived from adding gain to the base ISO of 400, and ISO 1250 is derived from subtracting gain from the base ISO of 3200. On broadcast cameras, it's more common to discuss decibels of gain versus ISO. These cameras run at their native sensitivity, whatever that is depending on the camera, and then add gain in increments of plus or minus 3 decibels at a time, which is equal to half of a stop of light. 6 decibels is 1 stop and 12 decibels is 2 stops. Blackmagic cameras display ISO at the camera head, but operate in decibels in the camera control software, which is a little confusing. The idea is that camera operators, if shooting on their own, are more used to making exposure calculations in terms of ISO, and camera shading technicians are used to operating in decibels, in which case the software and control panels operate in 2 decibel increments, which match the 1/3 increments found on the camera body. 0 decibels of gain on the Pocket Cinema camera represents ISO 400, the first native point on the sensor, and plus 18 decibels equals ISO 3200, the other native ISO. The jump from the lower native ISO to the higher happens between 8 and 10 decibels. Finally, let's go back to the equation and talk about iris. Changing shutter impacts motion blur. Changing ISO impacts noise. Changing iris impacts depth of field. If you're trying to get as much separation of your subject as possible from the background, you'll want to keep your iris as open as possible to create a shallow depth of field. And this lets a lot of light into the camera. Exposure equals iris plus shutter plus sensitivity. If the iris is nearly open, letting in a lot of light, and we don't want to touch the shutter, then we're really only left with sensitivity. There's only so much gain we can apply negatively before we simply run out of adjustment range. At that point, our only other option is to add a filter to block out some of the light before hitting the sensor. This is where NDs come in. Let's add that into the equation. Exposure equals iris plus shutter plus sensitivity plus ND. ND filters stand for neutral density. They're basically a fancy set of sunglasses for your camera. An ND filter blocks out light from reaching the sensor in a neutral way, which is to say they block out light without introducing any significant color cast to the image. In broadcast cameras, NDs sit between the lens and the sensor, and they're often motorized so they can be taken in and out of the image processing chain by remote control, so the camera operator doesn't have to reach around and do it manually. On cameras that do not have internal NDs, you can add a filter to the end of the lens to block out excess light if needed. Remember, changing iris impacts depth of field, changing shutter impacts motion blur, and changing ISO impacts noise. And depending on how much you open the iris to set for depth of field, you may need to add an ND filter to block out the light if your exposure settings get too high. So now that we know all this, we'll move on to setting up a camera to get a properly exposed image in the next video.